Hello, everybody. Today I'm sitting here with a good friend, with Ann Ordway, and Ann has been around IAMFC for many years, one of our leaders, and Ann, you also serve as the chairperson for our emerging leaders.
That's correct.
The IAMFC Emerging Leaders. And Dr. Ordway is, shall I just say, a hoot. We have so much fun, and it's really good to have those friends that you can laugh with. And it's
Absolutely.
really nice to have that relationship with her. Her expertise, one of her many areas of expertise, she has lots of letters behind her name, and she'll tell you about those in just a moment. But she presented a wonderful program here at IAMFC at the conference this year about working with military and military spouses. And so I wanted her to just recap a few things about that program and share with you some things that she'd like for you to know as family counselors.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be here with
If you can introduce yourself to them and tell them a little bit about your background and your credentials.
So, I'm Ann Ordway.
And she's from New Jersey. It's New Jersey and Texas here, so you're going to get lots of clash of multicultural accents.
Very interesting accents, different usages of various words in the English language, right? I come to counseling from a very unusual place. Specifically, I was a family law attorney in New Jersey for practicing as a litigator for close to 25 years. And in the course of things, I had some experiences which really made me stop and take stock in terms of the work that I was doing. And I realized that as a litigator, I had become a part of the problem, not a part of the solution. Because lawyers are very much about putting the Band-Aids on the bleeders, if you will, and about the win. And I really had gone into law to be a voice for people who didn't have a voice for themselves, and somehow I got lost in a broken system. So that's really what led me to find my way into counseling and then ultimately counselor education. So yes, I have a
interesting background.
I have a JD, and then I have I have a master's and then a PhD in counselor education.
Wonderful.
So it allows me to look at things from a different lens.
And Dr. Ordway, I want to add, has been a huge proponent and a big resource for us with IAMFC in terms of mixing the legal and the ethical. So that's another interview that we'll get to down the way, I think. But we're going to talk about the military spouses today, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. So I am a military spouse, and that's really what caused me to start thinking about the role that military spouses play in helping their deployed spouses, their active duty spouses, and their veteran spouses in terms of their reintegration and fitting back into what I'm going to use quotations, the quote normal society after the very unique military cultural experience. My own husband happens to be a Vietnam veteran, and he was Special Forces, so he was a Green Beret in Vietnam, which is a subculture within the culture. And I started to think about how in my own marriage and my own family, I've emerged as an advocate for him, and how I often become the first line of support when he's struggling with experiences and feelings about what it was like to be over there so many years ago.
It was notable in your presentation that you continually referred to that first line of support and how important that is. Could you help people understand, please expand on that?
So for people that have served in the military, there is a culture and a mindset, if you will, that reaching out for help is sometimes seen as a sign of weakness. And even if it's not received that way by the helpers, it absolutely is by the person seeking help. So they're reluctant to put themselves out there and to say, I'm feeling vulnerable because of these experiences, or I can't get these images out of my head, or this is how I'm relating to or reacting to PTSD symptoms. And so, they might be experiencing the nightmares, but it's that spouse laying next to them that feels the thrashing about and sees that person, shooting up in the middle of the night or calling out in their sleep. And they're the ones that see the depression. And know the differences between depression and suicidality and suicide ideation and, what sometimes presents as aggression.
Absolutely.
And, we know as counselors that sometimes depression particularly in men, will present with an aggressive front.
Yes. Yes.
When it's really that deep, forlorn feeling. And, especially for older veterans, people in that Vietnam and Korean generation, what you're also seeing is you're seeing that connection to masculinity, and I can't cry and I can't say that I'm vulnerable. And so when you think about it from an Ericksonian perspective, in that last stage of life where it's ego, integrity versus despair, we're seeing despair.
Yes.
And we're seeing the despair in our military members, even when they're no longer directly active service. They're veterans, and maybe they separated many years earlier, but they're feeling it now as their lives are, I'm going to say, winding down, and they're starting to really reflect on their journey, and they're feeling that moral injury. How is it that I, the good Catholic boy, or the person who has this Christian or religious connection, who believes in God and who has read the commandments, thou shalt not kill, how do I reconcile the fact that I went over there and I did these, again in quotes, terrible things, and I'm responsible for having taken other people's lives.
Absolutely.
Even though it was kill or be killed. And so that spouse is the one that is sometimes listening to that. And feeling that despair and trying to elevate the mood and hearing the stories, and sometimes hearing the stories in graphic detail, even though the spouse is a civilian and they themselves haven't been there and they don't understand it, and their experience of war is what they've seen in movies. And now here's this person they love.
What do we see in the movies?
Oh my gosh, very graphic but glam.
What we see now is very different in movies than what we saw even 15, 20 years ago?
Absolutely.
Because it's so graphic and so in your face.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that in my younger years, I was not a fan of watching movies like Hamburger Hill because I found them so disturbing. And now I'm married to somebody who lived Hamburger Hill. And it makes the movie so much real. And so much more realistic. And I thank God all the time that I'm a therapist, because that education and that background allows me to be more of a support system, whereas I think most military spouses don't have that.
Right.
They don't have the education, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the experiences in any version of the trenches to really be able to support. And so when they're trying to support, they internalize, and I think what we're seeing is vicarious trauma.
Yes.
I think we're seeing compassion fatigue, anxiety, depression, and then the Veterans Administration is offering services for the service member and even for the family in a collective form, but not really for the spouses.
Not focused on the spouse.
Right. And so that's the purpose.
One thing that couple of things I found really fascinating that I'd like for you to discuss, and then we want to move to practical things that you want to talk to family counselors about regarding these areas. But first, one of the things that you mentioned yesterday in the presentation that really struck a note, I think, with the audience was about the idea of compassion fatigue. And we apply those things so often to counselors, and we have to do extra things as wellness, for our own wellness in order to ethically practice, which we talk about a lot in ethics. But for this, it's the same type of compassion fatigue, and you were drawing parallels with that with the spouse. So speak for a moment about that.
So I think we know that compassion fatigue is the cost of caring, and it's really the exhaustion that comes from empathy and truly connecting with a client and having that therapeutic alliance. And for a counselor, we try to really kind of immerse ourselves in our clients' experiences so that we can support them and partner with them and help them get to a better place and heal. For a spouse, without necessarily the preparedness and the education that goes with what we do, they're trying to support this person that they love, who may have come back from war different than the person that left.
Yes, they changed fundamentally.
And it's a 24-hour thing. It's not a once a week appointment for 50 minutes. It's a 24-hour thing from the minute you get up in the morning till the minute you go to bed. And for some, that is absolutely exhausting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the spouse is taking on roles of advocacy, roles of support, roles that are almost quasi-counseling. And when we talk about vicarious trauma, we talk about counselors who sometimes, hear the graphic details of our clients' experiences and how those details begin to affect us and sometimes haunt us in our dreams. And then you have a spouse, again, without the preparedness and without the knowledge and education, listening to some of these graphic stories and graphic details and not necessarily always being able to separate out what's really going on with my husband, my wife, and not really being able to react to that appropriately. And so there's that internalization. But the other thing that I've been seeing lately is that there are, and so far I've seen this predominantly with males, but I've encountered several service members who either have or have not been diagnosed with PTSD, but where in the context of a divorce, a spouse has used some of what was shared in the marriage and some of the experiences I'm talking about to either label and diagnose the PTSD, but to connect it up with aggression and violence and an accusation of domestic violence, whether or not it's true. And because we have uneducated lawyers and judges in this context, it's easy to buy into that because this man who is separated from the military or who is active service, he was in Afghanistan or he was in Iraq or he was in Vietnam, and we know what he did, right? He had a gun and he killed people. So therefore, her version of he's aggressive and he's dangerous and he's a threat must be true. And it's easier without that assessment to accept that label. And so what I'm finding is that there's some bias application.
Yes.
And there's not a sufficient level of risk assessment to really determine, is this person really a threat? Or are we just accepting a label? Or even, perhaps that spouse's sense of fear that's coming from a lack of understanding and a lack of education, not because that person really would hurt them.
Right, right.
And sometimes it's a manipulation. Sometimes it's somebody saying, hey, I'm going to use this to my advantage so that I get custody of the children and you don't. And so there's such a sticky, it's like such a slippery.
Need to be aware of that.
Absolutely.
Because if we're getting triangulated into that process,
good word,
unwittingly,
absolutely,
then that could be very detrimental for everybody involved.
Absolutely.
So what we're going to do is we're going to end this portion and we'll do a part 2 of this in just a moment with practical applications. So thank you for visiting with us.
My pleasure.
And stay tuned for part 2. Thank you.